There are moments in history when nations must rise with dignity and speak with clarity, not out of arrogance, but from a deep conviction of sovereignty and justice. Today, I stand before you not to fuel conflict between nations, but to remind us all, especially the powerful, that respect must be mutual, and lectures must not come from a place of hypocrisy. The United States, a beacon to many, has often held the torch of liberty high. But when that torch is used to cast shadows over another sovereign nation's internal laws, it is no longer a light, it becomes a weapon. India, a land of ancient wisdom and proud democracy, has shown that it does not require validation from any power to uphold its integrity. This is not a clash of civilizations. It is a call for humility in international discourse. It is a reminder that no nation, however mighty, has the right to patronize another. Today, India has responded not with aggression, but with clarity, strength, and a quiet firmness, a metaphorical slap that echoes with dignity, not disdain. Sovereignty is the cornerstone of a nation's identity. It defines a country's right to govern itself without external interference, to make laws and to uphold its values based on its own historical, cultural, and constitutional framework. When one nation questions or challenges the sovereignty of another, especially on matters internal to that nation, it undermines the principles of equality and respect that form the foundation of international relations. India, as the world's largest democracy, has every right to pass legislation that serves its national interest in accordance with its constitutional values. The Citizenship Amendment Act (CA) was debated, challenged, and passed through democratic means within a system that allows for public dissent, legal scrutiny, and political discourse. To have another country, however powerful, question or criticize such an act from a moral high ground is both inappropriate and deeply flawed. There exists a dangerous tendency among some powerful nations to assume a role of global moral arbiters, selectively intervening in the affairs of other sovereign states while ignoring or justifying their own historical and ongoing human rights issues. This double standard not only breeds resentment, but also damages the spirit of genuine cooperation and diplomacy. Sovereignty must not be a principle that is defended when convenient and discarded when disagreeable. It must be honored universally, especially when a country like India, diverse, pluralistic, and democratic, makes decisions that reflect its own lived experiences and regional complexities. Lecturing India on matters like the CAA without a full understanding of the socio-political and humanitarian context behind it is not only dismissive but condescending. It implies that Indian lawmakers and institutions are incapable of acting with justice or compassion, a notion that is deeply disrespectful. When a sovereign nation like India receives criticism from another nation with a history of its own discriminatory laws and practices, it must be called out for what it is: hypocrisy disguised as concern. Sovereignty is not just a legal right. It is a symbol of a nation's maturity and strength. India's decision to respond firmly and clearly is not just an assertion of independence, but a reminder that global respect must be earned through mutual understanding, not one-sided judgment. No country, regardless of its power, influence, or historical significance, holds the exclusive right to define morality for the rest of the world. Morality is not the inheritance of a single nation, nor can it be dictated across borders without context or humility. The belief that one nation has a superior moral compass while others must constantly be corrected or taught reveals a deep-rooted arrogance that undermines the very spirit of equality among nations. When the United States chooses to lecture India, or any other sovereign state, on human rights, democracy, or citizenship policies, it must first look inward and reflect on its own long and complicated record. From systemic racism and immigration inequalities to foreign interventions with devastating consequences, the U.S. has its own set of moral challenges that it continues to struggle with. Thus, attempting to occupy a position of global moral authority while remaining blind to these flaws creates a dangerous imbalance in international relations. True morality is rooted in introspection, not in self-righteousness. It is not about pointing fingers, but about engaging in respectful dialogue. When morality is used as a weapon in diplomacy, it ceases to be a guiding principle and instead becomes a tool for control and manipulation. This kind of moral posturing erodes trust between nations. India, with its millennia-old civilizational ethos and deep democratic roots, does not need a moral certificate from any external power. Its policies, including the Citizenship Amendment Act, are products of internal debate, legal scrutiny, and national consensus, even if they remain subjects of contestation within its own population. To suggest that India lacks the moral foundation to address its own issues is to deny its people the dignity and agency they have rightfully earned. Moral superiority, when wielded by one country over another, often disguises political motivations. It allows nations to deflect attention from their own failings while projecting an image of benevolent oversight. But such projection is unsustainable in a world that is increasingly multipolar and conscious of historical injustice. It is time the world moves away from this unipolar sense of moral entitlement. Every nation must be allowed to determine its own path within the framework of international law and mutual respect. India does not claim moral superiority, but it rightly demands moral equality, and in doing so it reminds the world that leadership is not about preaching. It is about listening, understanding, and growing together. India's constitution stands as a beacon of democracy, justice, and secularism. It was crafted with the utmost care and deliberation by leaders who emerged from the fires of colonial rule. Inspired by the vision of an inclusive, sovereign nation, every law passed in India, including the Citizenship Amendment Act (CA), must go through rigorous debate, judicial oversight, and constitutional validation. The CAA is no exception. It was enacted through democratic channels, discussed and passed by both houses of Parliament, challenged in courts, and debated vigorously across civil society. To claim that it undermines democratic values without acknowledging the process behind its creation is to overlook the strength of India's constitutional mechanisms. India is not a fragile democracy, it is a resilient one, and in a democracy it is not uncommon for laws to spark controversy or disagreement. That in itself is not a flaw. It is a sign of a functioning republic where dissent is not only allowed but encouraged. The Citizenship Amendment Act does not dismantle the constitutional promise of equality. Rather, it addresses a specific historical and humanitarian issue concerning persecuted minorities from neighboring countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, who have long faced religious discrimination. It offers expedited citizenship to Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, Jains, and Buddhists who arrived in India before a certain cut-off date. This does not mean it excludes Muslims from Indian citizenship altogether, as often misrepresented. Muslims from any country can still apply for Indian citizenship under existing provisions. The CA is a targeted relief measure, not a blanket exclusionary law. This distinction is essential in any honest analysis of the Act's intent and scope. Misinterpreting it without examining its legal structure not only does injustice to India's legislative process, but also spreads unnecessary fear and misinformation. India's judiciary, media, and vibrant civil society provide continuous checks and balances on any legislative action. The Supreme Court is currently hearing petitions challenging the Act, and any constitutional conflict will be addressed through lawful means. This is how democracy work, not by foreign powers issuing statements of disapproval, but by institutions working internally to uphold justice. India's trust in its constitutional values is not performative, it is deeply ingrained in its national character. Even during times of disagreement and protest, the nation does not shy away from dialogue or reform. That is the essence of democracy, allowing room for debate without allowing foreign judgment to cloud national sovereignty. The criticism surrounding the CAA must be grounded in facts, not narratives shaped by misunderstanding or political bias. To disregard India's constitutional safeguards and call into question its commitment to democracy is not just incorrect. It is disrespectful to the very foundation of its republic. Selective outrage is one of the most damaging traits in international politics, eroding trust, distorting facts, and undermining genuine human rights advocacy. When countries choose to raise their voice only when it suits their geopolitical interests, while remaining silent or even complicit in graver violations elsewhere, it reveals a troubling double standard. The criticism India faced over the Citizenship Amendment Act CAA is a perfect example. The very nations that questioned India's internal policy, crafted through democratic institutions and aimed at providing refuge to persecuted minorities, have often turned a blind eye to far more severe and systemic violations, both within their own borders and among their allies. When outrage is selective, it loses its moral force and begins to look like interference rather than concern. It stops being about human rights and starts being about political leverage. For instance, many of the countries that criticize the CAA have histories of deeply discriminatory immigration laws, racial profiling, forced deportations, and mistreatment of refugees. Some continue to separate families at borders, detain children in harsh conditions, and enact policies that openly discriminate against minorities. Yet these practices are often justified or ignored in international discourse, especially when committed by powerful or strategically important nations. In contrast, when India enacts a narrowly defined amendment meant to address a specific regional and religious persecution issue, it faces widespread condemnation from the same global voices. Such inconsistency does not reflect principled advocacy, it reflects strategic selectivity, and that selectivity weakens the credibility of those who claim to defend universal human rights. Genuine concern requires consistency. If a country truly stands for human rights, it must hold itself to the same standards it expects from others. It must acknowledge its own flaws, past and present, and commit to change not just abroad, but at home. Selective outrage, on the other hand, is rooted in politics, not principles. It is deployed when convenient and silenced when uncomfortable. India's critics must understand that respect in international relations is not built on lectures, but on fairness. When only certain nations are targeted for actions that others regularly commit without consequence, the integrity of global dialogue suffers. The credibility of institutions, media, and leaders diminishes when their moral outrage is seen as biased or opportunistic. India, like any vibrant democracy, welcomes debate, dissent, and reform, but it does not accept being singled out unfairly by nations unwilling to reflect on their own contradictions. A country's credibility on human rights issues comes not just from what it says abroad, but from what it does at home. And when outrage is reserved only for geopolitical opponents or when allies are exempt from scrutiny, the message becomes clear: it's not about principles, it's about power. For a truly just international order, the world must move beyond this pattern of selective criticism and embrace a standard of accountability that applies equally to all. Only then can global advocacy carry real weight and moral authority. India's response to external criticism over the Citizenship Amendment Act CAA was measured, principled and rooted in dignity. Rather than reacting with hostility or inflammatory rhetoric, India chose the path of clarity, calmly reiterating its sovereign right to legislate for its people. This restrained yet firm stance reflects not only maturity in diplomatic engagement, but also confidence in the strength of its democratic institutions. India did not resort to aggressive counterattacks, nor did it attempt to silence dissenting voices abroad. Instead, it communicated its position through official channels, public statements, and reasoned arguments. Such an approach is not just a defensive reaction, it is a reflection of India's belief that truth, when expressed calmly and clearly, is more powerful than any loud denunciation. This dignified response stands in contrast to how many nations respond when their internal policies are challenged. Some shut down international dialogue, others deflect by attacking unrelated issues. India, however, did neither. It took the opportunity to explain the humanitarian reasoning behind the CAA, highlighting its goal of protecting persecuted minorities in neighboring theocratic states. This was not an act of defiance, but one of transparency. The tone was not of confrontation, but of self-respect. India did not ask for approval, it asked for understanding, and in doing so it reminded the global community that disagreement is natural, but dignity in dialogue is essential. This composure should not be mistaken for weakness. It is the strength of a nation that knows its values and stands by them. Furthermore, India's response was grounded in facts, not emotional appeals or political slogans. It cited legal provisions, referenced international precedents, and emphasized that its doors remain open to all communities under existing citizenship laws. This calm articulation of facts helped dismantle many misinterpretations that were circulating in the international press and diplomatic circles. It also exposed the lack of nuanced understanding among many of its critics, who were quick to judge without examining the full legal and regional context. India's handling of the situation became a case study in how to assert sovereignty without aggression, how to uphold national interest without compromising international dignity. This quiet firmness has also earned respect across parts of the world that value balanced diplomacy. Many observers saw in India's response not just a political reaction, but a philosophical stance, that real strength lies not in shouting back, but in standing tall with truth. When a nation conducts itself with grace under pressure, it reinforces its moral standing on the world stage. India's calm, respectful yet assertive reply reaffirmed that dignity is not just a personal virtue, it is a national one. This kind of response builds trust, opens channels for better understanding, and sets an example for how sovereign nations can engage even in disagreement.